Germs are our worst enemy. They cause untold death and disability. They run amok, and there really isn't much you can do about it. You can use hand sanitizer many times a day. You can stay indoors. Or you have to go outside, you could wear a mask. Or if you're very lucky, or you have great genetics, you might not get sick. But if you aren't so lucky, and luck really is what it comes down to, your only hope is the newest blockbuster drug. Or if you don't want to catch it at all, you better take the vaccine. That's a story we're all familiar with, right? It's the one we've heard for the last 75 years in classrooms, books, news programs, magazines, and doctors' offices for most of or all of our lives. And it was a story that was on everyone's lips at the expense of nearly everything else for the last 3 years. Where did this story come from? Is it part of the collective experience because it's inherently true? Or has it become accepted as inherent for other reasons? And what were the origins of this story? What places can we trace it back to its origin? I believe its earliest roots come from a time where people were searching for answers in a time of darkness. Because the seeds of this tale reach back to a time when diseases like cholera, smallpox, and the Black Death took down millions of people. A time when bad humors or the ether was blamed for illness running rampantly through dark, dank, and dirty cities. During a time when many women and children did not survive childbirth, and people had large families because they needed the labor, and many, many people died young. But none of the people who are telling that story now were alive in those times. It's based on other people. But people cite numbers and statistics as if they were pulling them out of the recess of the mind. Those were times before the concept of sanitation existed. When literally excrement was thrown into the streets. A time before there was the concept of water or food purification. So these ideas became well known, and the causative agents in illness from poor sanitation were discovered, and modern people ran with this idea. So who in recent times perpetuated the idea that germs are the sole player in whether or not someone falls ill? There's a few main historical players, and then many more recent proponents of this idea. The first was a woman by the name of Lady Mary Montagu. Lady Montagu was an English aristocrat and writer. And when she was a child, her father inoculated her with a tiny dose of smallpox after learning about the practice while his travels to Turkey. And the lady helped to bring the idea into her very affluent circles, as that idea of inoculation had previously been perceived as a dirty folk practice. Interestingly, much like today, the introduction of this practice into the culture created a pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine argument in modern England, as people rushed to either side of the debate. The idea dates back at least as far as the height of Egyptian civilization, and quite possibly further than that. But Jenner gets credit for coming up with the most recent iteration of the practice. He was a scientist and a physician who had heard for years that countryside milkmaids didn't fall ill and die from smallpox. It was also sort of commonly known that it's because the cows had a similar disease to smallpox called cowpox. And so Jenner made the leap that he took some pus from a cowpox pustule and injected it into the arm of a 9-year-old young boy. And the boy became ill with cowpox. He got sick, he had a fever, he had an eruption. Jenner waited some time, and then he inoculated the boy with smallpox in the same manner. And the boy didn't get sick. So he had proven his theorem. That was really the most modern version of vaccination. And he had revitalized and modernized the ancient idea of inoculating patients with small amounts of the disease for which he was trying to protect. You know, an often overlooked fact and historical side note is that Samuel Hahnemann, the creator of homeopathy, and Edward Jenner both created codified systems by which to introduce small doses in order to protect against a disease within 1 year of one another. Neither one of them with any knowledge of the other one's work. Jenner used a material dose, Hahnemann an immaterial dose. He then extrapolated his work in the beaker into human beings, and the germ theory was born. So he, Mary Montagu, and Edward Jenner are really the historical figures who bridge the gap between widespread rampant infectious disease due to poor sanitation and to modern times. These are the people whose intellect and curiosity help to define the role that pathogens play in the infectious story. These three stories propelled the germ to be the most important factor in the story of infectious disease. And they brought to light in an otherwise scary and miserable time some understanding, something that people could hold on to. But that's only part of the story. There's a parallel tale that runs much deeper into antiquity. And many, many others have told a different story. One where the health of the host is at least as important as the pathogen itself. Along the way, there have been thousands of years of Chinese medicine practitioners who, of course, dealt with widespread epidemics in their populations. And they understood that external forces, they may not have known they were a bacteria or a virus, but they got the idea of external wind coming into the body, and that this could affect the immunological health of a patient. In Ayurvedic medicine, they understood these concepts too, for thousands of years. And in herbal medicine, practitioners have also recognized that it's an interplay between the person and the pathogens. And then in more recent years, in the last couple hundred years, we have the naturopaths and the homeopaths who've tried to rectify those two systems and come to a place of balance between them. And all of these other more ancient, much more established schools of medicine tell a different story than one where the sole antagonist is an unseen, often unidentifiable pathogen wafting by on an air current or waiting on a surface for us to interact with them. In fact, every other system of medicine, besides the very current recent paradigm, states something directly to the opposite of the current narrative. All of those other systems of medicine view the body like a landscape, one that has a whole ecology full of flora and fauna, one where what we put into our bodies, the amount and the quality of sleep, exercise, love, and play contributes in a fundamental way to whether we stay healthy or are likely to die of infectious disease. All these systems of medicine also have a philosophical background, a framework to understand not only the disease, but what it means to have disease, or to be diseased, or to recover from disease. All of these systems recognize the existence of infectious pathogens. Not one of them claims that they don't exist or that they cannot cause disease. Instead, every single one of them state that when the system is in balance, the pathogens cause very little illness. But what I think we see instead today is that when people are faced with fear, they run to the edge and they run away from this inherently true, well-established, ancient knowledge. I think we've also all seen in recent years that people like simple answers. They like cut and dry. Yes or no. Black or white. Up or down. Because disease and illness is inherently scary. And if someone of authority can offer comfort or solace, it makes them feel less anxious. Working with patients for nearly 20 years is that it isn't cut and dry. I mean, on one hand, infectious agents can be downright deadly. And yet most of the time, if the person is in balance, pathogens do very little or nothing at all. Because the reality is we're surrounded by them. The entire world is blanketed in viruses, bacteria, and fungi, and molds. They're literally everywhere. And 99.99999% of them don't make us sick. Because our bodies are amazing. Let me tell you one of the ways I came to see this in my practice, and it has to do with sex. That always gets everyone's attention. Over the years, I've had a countless number of patients with type 2 genital herpes. This is the type of herpes most commonly contracted during a sexual encounter, and it's extremely common. Most of these people have had the infection for decades and have struggled to varying degrees to keep the symptoms at bay. Now, many of these patients of mine have regular sexual partners, husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, and many of these people are also my patients. And a large cohort of these partners never, ever present with any of the signs of a herpes infection. None of the pain, tingling, burning, eruptions, or even the full body flu-like symptoms that can appear in people with herpes. Despite having regular sexual encounters with their partners, some people over decades, a lot of people never get it. That always troubled me. It really drove me nuts, actually. I couldn't figure out how that was possible. If you think about the idea that there's this highly infectious virus that you're bound to catch, that you've been worried about and trained about and talked about your whole life, and then it doesn't happen, and not once, but many, many, many times. The other piece of it that really got to me too was the people who did have the herpetic eruptions, and how extremely difficult it could be for me, someone who I feel has quite a few tools at his disposal, to quell those eruptions in some of my patients sometimes. People who would just have herpes eruptions over and over and over again. And because I'm inherently very disinclined to use medications, when I do, I feel it is a deep failure on my part to do my job. That even though I would try all of the best natural medicine therapeutics, all of the good antiviral herbs we have, like lemon balm and licorice and St. John's wort, those damn eruptions would come back every time the patient had a stressful encounter, every time they got sick with something else. Every time, you name it, it would just come back and keep coming back. And so that bugged me for years. One day, I don't remember what it was. I don't remember the specific patient, but I do remember I had an epiphany. And I thought, what is it that all viruses have in common? As I was staring at this blistering red rash on this person's buttocks. It was in that moment that I realized all viruses have a discharge. Every virus that you contract expresses with a discharge. Whether that's pus from the eyes, runny nose, cough, fever, sweat, bleeding, eruptions, every single one has a discharge. Now, from what I know in my trainings, being a homeopath and a naturopath, that we're always trying to elicit discharges from the body. We're always trying to bring the being to a higher state of health by removing toxic substances from the body. And so I thought, what if that's what a virus is trying to do? Well, instead of giving antiviral herbs to the next patient that came in with type 2 herpes, I started to detoxify them. And they got less and less and less and less eruptions. Those people that had suffered for decades literally stopped having those blisters over and over and over again. By supporting the pathways of elimination in the body, we reduce the body's need to continually try to express the materials from the host. And now I began to see other examples of this everywhere I looked in my patients. And I began to see how people who got the sickest with acute viral illnesses always had a heavy body burden of toxins. Well, thankfully, when COVID came along, almost 3 years to the day, I had already learned this lesson. And I understood that detoxification was critical in viruses, and that it must be addressed and maintained in order to not have the patient die on you. And to date, we haven't lost a single COVID patient. In our clinic, I stopped counting a long time ago, but I'm sure we've treated over 1,000 COVID cases, and it's still going every single day. And though COVID has its own unique characteristics, in some ways it's quite unlike any virus I've ever seen, it was still of paramount importance to make sure the patient was detoxifying. By keeping the bowels, kidneys, and the skin open to detoxify the byproducts of cellular metabolism. And let's not forget that we live in an extremely toxic world. Never before have we been exposed to so many microplastics, heavy metals, mycotoxins, pesticides, which require the body to dispel or discharge, or you'll become ill. Our very own cells are toxin factories too. By the very process of cellular metabolism, by making energy, by breaking down compounds, we create intracellular toxins. Those also have to be dispelled. And if we're suppressing those discharges, just a little bit of steroids there, just a little bit of steroids there, just a little bit of that salve there, just a little of that medication there, we're driving those things back into the body. So how do we stay safe in the age of infectious disease? As the WHO and the G20 are already telling us to prepare for the next pandemic. They've already said it's on its way. In my mind, it's a foregone conclusion that we will be locked down, masked up, and kept in our homes in the not too distant future with a virus that's slightly more deadly than SARS-CoV-2. So what can we do to our bodies to be prepared for that? How can we take into account the host, the landscape that we are, and the other part of the equation of infectious disease that we have direct control over? I feel there are 4 very important parts. One is our diet. And in my book, I have an acronym called Back to the Plow. PLOW. P stands for plants. We're supposed to eat plants. I'm not saying exclusively. I'm not saying that's the only thing we're supposed to eat, but we are designed to eat plants. Plants literally break down the earth and turn it into things that we can imbibe to make part of our structure. They give us access to compounds that we don't otherwise have access to. So I believe the greater proportion of our diets should be made up of plants. These should be organic. If we can get them locally, even better. Buy them locally from people that grow them, or grow them ourselves. L is for low to no sugar. We really aren't supposed to eat sugar. It's really not good for us. It depresses immunological function. It disrupts endocrine function. It damages gastrointestinal function. It's really not something we should be eating on a regular basis. Are fruit sugars okay? Sure, in moderation. Is honey okay? Sure, in moderation. But any of the synthetic sugars, any of the high fructose sugar, it really, really shouldn't pass our lips, but on rare occasions. O is for organic. We really have to be eating organic. The damage that organophosphates and other pesticides do to our bodies, it's catastrophic. It's one of the main reasons why we have an epidemic of autism. It's one of the main reasons why we have an epidemic of cancer. It's one of the key players in cardiovascular disease. It disrupts our inborn flora and fauna, causing us to have more pathogenic species in our bowel than healthy species. It leads to Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions. And so, if there's one choice you can make at the grocery store, it really is to buy organic food. Now, I know there are problems with this farm is next to that farm and pesticides blow over, and it's hard to be perfect. But I can tell you, we check our patients' urine for toxic compounds all the time. And even people who say they eat exclusively organic still show up with glyphosate in their urine. And so, in my mind, we have to try and decrease it as much as we possibly can, because we have the ability to excrete those compounds, but only to a certain degree. If there's more coming in than going out, you're going to create oxidative stress and damage to your cells. So we have to do our best as possible to eat organic. The W in Back to the Plow stands for watch the simple carbohydrates. Bread, rice, cereal, pasta, grains. They should be a small part of our diet. You know, along our evolutionary path, we have not spent that long having access to simple carbohydrates like we do now. You can walk down to the gas station and get 5,000 calories of empty carbohydrates for $5. And our brains are hardwired to crave it. You know, we spent millennia on the savannah hunting, gathering, trying to gain as many calories as we could, and that programming's still in there. So we really should try and cut back on the simple carbohydrates. It balances our blood sugar, it lowers our cancer risk, it supports our cardiovascular system. Plants, low to no sugar, organic, watch the carbohydrates. Diet is extremely important in keeping ourselves healthy from infectious disease. 2 is exercise. Getting fit is one of the best things we can do to keep ourselves healthy. And that means cardiovascular exercise 5 to 6 days per week. Some kind of movement every single day. Cardiovascular means you're working your cardiovascular system. That means you need to be breathing hard and sweating. And anything short of that is just movement, and it counts as movement. You also have to do strength training. And if you don't like weights, do push-ups, sit-ups, planks, and squats. You can do them without any equipment. The 2 biggest killers on the planet are cardiovascular disease and cancer. And these 2, though we separate them in our minds, medicine tends to separate them, we tend to think about them as different diseases, they are intimately intertwined. They share 2 critical components. One is lack of circulation, and 2 is inflammation. Cardiovascular exercise and strength training target circulation and inflammation. So if you want to stave off heart disease and cancer, you row, you swim, you bike, you do yoga, you ski. Every time you do that, you're lowering your risk of developing the 2 biggest diseases on the planet. We are not meant to be sedentary. Sitting all days at desks, behind computers, indoors, this is not what our bodies are designed to do. I mean, look at us. We're supposed to run and jump and climb and hike. So instead of donating to a campaign with a pink ribbon, get yourself out on a jog every day. Break a sweat. Do some kind of strength training every day. And it doesn't have to be a lot. 20 minutes, that's all it takes. But it needs to be consistent. And if we do this over many years, your risk factors for all of those diseases fall. And therefore your susceptibility to infectious disease. Number 3, and we already talked about it, is detoxification. I think we should do something every single day to empty the bucket. We have this unending supply of toxins in the air and water. 5G, 6G, 10G, 50G. It's not stopping. They're going to continue to roll it out. And everyone is sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies to varying degrees. Some people just aren't aware that they're developing symptoms from being around those frequencies. And unfortunately, the more toxic you become, the more sensitive you are to those frequencies. So we need to empty our body of those things. Yes, we need to go to city council meetings, and yes, we need to stand up and say no. That's how we're going to stop it. But we also need to get ourselves as healthy as possible so we're less susceptible to those. My book has lots of ideas in there for easy, inexpensive solutions for detoxification. I wanted to put things in there that people could do at home at no cost or very low cost. Things like dry skin brushing and castor oil packs, taking hot baths, jumping up and down, sweating. When you sweat, you dump mycotoxins, you dump plastics, you dump metals, you dump glyphosate. Just sweating. Another really simple thing to do is to use low-dose binders away from food and supplements. To take things like charcoal and clay and chlorella away from your other supplements, away from foods. I often have people do them at night, right before bed. And those compounds will bind up toxins in your gastrointestinal tract when you sleep and excrete them in your stool. You have to go slow and gentle. If you're toxic, you'll pick up a lot of compounds and you'll drop a lot. You'll feel a lot worse. So listen to your body. Go very slow. Very, very slow. Don't ever push through a detoxification process. It will only make you sicker in the long run. If I could pick one thing to have people invest in their homes, I would have them invest in a sauna, though. Saunas are the best tool we have. That's why it's such a pervasive technique through so many cultures. The 4th thing is deal with your background infections. This is something that is just categorically ignored in conventional medicine. Really, they only really talk about acute infections. But we know that our bodies have a huge burden of bacteria, viruses, parasites, protozoa, and mold. And as we stated earlier, if we're in balance, they don't cause a lot of problems. But if we're not, those infections can flare and create all sorts of symptoms in the body. Things like candida, we're supposed to have some candida in our bodies. It's a normal fungus in the bowel. But if we're exposed to a moldy environment and we inhale some spores of aspergillus, let's say, they can grow in our guts. We're supposed to have species of staphylococcus and streptococcus in our bowel. But if we go camping up in the woods and we drink some water from a stream and we pick up some protozoa, those travelers can create all sorts of problems in our guts for decades. And because I test those things in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, I can tell you people are often very surprised to learn about the critters that they have traveling along with them that are causing a lot of their chronic symptoms. The headaches, the constantly runny nose, the gas, the bloating, the prostate issues. Many of those things are tied back to infectious agents that are not being detected otherwise. And so I would urge you to look at that piece too for your health. If we can do all those things, I think we can make ourselves healthy enough that no matter what comes along with the next epidemic or next pandemic, that we can be healthy enough to weather it, not have to run out and take an experimental drug, not have to lock ourselves into our homes in fear, but instead recognize that there's a natural interplay between viruses and humans. If you only work on these 4 things, I'll think you will be in a much better place the next time something big comes along. I want to thank you all very much for listening. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to answer any questions. We're going to have a microphone we're going to pass around so we can have...
I've turned on a room.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
You did mention water, drinking water. You feel that's important?
Absolutely.
And how much do you recommend? Is that
I actually think about that question a lot because there's been all these ideas that we're supposed to drink a certain amount of ounces a day per water. I honestly don't think I've ever seen a true study that tells me that I believe the person actually knew what they were talking about in regards to how much water we should drink. I think if you're thirsty, you're not drinking enough water. And so what I do is I fill myself up a big glass jar every day. I put my minerals in it. I use my terahertz frequency wand to structure my water. There's lots of different ways you can structure water. And I drink 2 of those a day. And if I'm not thirsty, I'm drinking enough water. If I'm still thirsty, I'm not drinking enough water. But it's very important. It's a huge place we get toxic exposures.
So in that same vein, a lot of things are coming out about hydrogen. So part of water, but hydrogen, sort of hydrogen starved, and that hydrogen is really available in fruits and vegetables, like it's been worked, and our system likes it as a hydration that way. But do you see anything in that world of hydrogen? I have a hydrogen, a Brown's gas machine myself, which is something that kind of led me in that direction. And I'm not quite sure if it's doing much, but it's an interesting concept, and I wondered what you
I
see
haven't
about
spent much time looking
with
at
it.
that. No.
Mhm. Go.
Yeah. Kelly?
What do you think about lectins and eliminating lectins out of your diet? I've been on the Plant Paradox program,
Sure.
and it's kind of fascinating, the book and the concept.
Yeah, so Gundry, who's a medical doctor, who actually was quite outspoken in the pandemic about his feelings, which was really nice to see. It was sort of a surprise, and he got, maligned and pushed over to the sides where would never have guessed. He came up with the idea in a book called The Plant Paradox that there are certain compounds in some plants and fruits and vegetables that because of their seeding process and the time they go to seed and when they're ripe, that those lectins, if imbibed by humans or animals, can cause a large degree of inflammation. I've seen that diet do wonders for 75% of the people that try it. Not everybody. Not everybody seems to be terribly sensitive to it. But I've certainly seen people who've had arthritic-like complaints, pain, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, who've been very much helped by that diet. Have you noticed it's helped you?
Definitely,
Yeah.
and it's for the inflammation
Yeah.
and I get headaches, like these fluorescent lights, I hate them, and do you have a homeopathic remedy or something to recommend for headaches? Because I don't want to take aspirin, I don't want to do the pharmaceuticals, so.
Sure. Well, that's the trick with homeopathy, is that we never give the same remedy for anything. Every person in this room who has headaches would get a different remedy. And that's what makes homeopathy difficult, but it's also what makes it curative and brilliant when we give the right one. Yeah, it's really about your constitution. Yeah, yeah.
I rely heavily on ferments, which I make myself, and one of them is kombucha.
Mm-hmm.
And I eat a very low sugar diet, but I make kombucha with raw organic sugars. I know you can make them with honey, but both of them are sugars.
Yeah.
So, but then I hear that they are digested, and so when they enter your body, it's a different form, or it's not as much of a problem. Do you have any thoughts on?
I've seen people who have quite a bit of trouble from the sugars of kombucha. And I'll say it in another way. I think people that are very sensitive to sugars, people whose fungal cultures are out of balance, people whose bacterial cultures are out of balance, can have quite a bit of trouble with kombucha. I think those same sugars, back to that idea that we have a lot of fungus in our body. We naturally do. It appears that millions of years ago, we started a symbiotic relationship with several different fungi. Mucorrhizmosis, a form of aspergillus, they live inside of us. And this is completely ignored in conventional medicine. They don't talk about it at all, but we know they're there. And those funguses very much like sugar. It's one of the, simple carbohydrates are an easy food for them. When we eat the right amount of them, they stay in balance. When we don't, they grow dramatically out of balance. And mucorrhizmosis, which is the fungus that looks like we imbibed, perhaps millions of years ago, the more it grows out of balance, the more heart disease we have, the more clotting we have. So feeding that with a diet that's too high in sugar directly leads to cardiovascular disease. So I think we have to listen to our own bodies and recognize, hey, I'm drinking this kombucha and I'm recognizing I'm starting to have these symptoms. That's the beauty of the human body, right? As someone called out earlier, our bodies are amazing. If you're really listening, you can tell what's good for you and what's not good for you.
How you feel.
Yeah. You have this barometer that tells you. We just tend to ignore it, right? Because the chocolate cake tastes so good. You have another question?
Have you used the vibrating platform at all?
Mm-hmm.
You
I'm a
vib-
big fan of those.
Yeah, I am too.
Yeah. I was tempted to put that in my book as well as other detox things, but I wanted to make it something that people didn't have to spend a lot of money. But I had written a whole section on vibrating plates. I think it's a great way to move your lymph, move your circulation. They're fantastic tools. You know, they tend to have them in places like the Y, you can stand on them, but they also make home units. They're only a couple $100. Yeah, those are great.
Does the Y have one? I haven't looked.
think
but
all's
that
well.
would be great if they do.
Allswell.
Allswell does?
Yeah.
I've been to other Ys that do. I don't know if this one does. But Allswell has one in there you can go and use?
Yeah,
Oh,
for
great.
$2 for like 10 minutes.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, yeah.
What type of sauna do you recommend for the home use?
Sure. There's a brand, I can't remember the name right now, but it's a zip-up one that you can sit in and your head sticks out of.
What's the question?
Sauna.
Home saunas. And I was skeptical about those before I had used one myself. The brand name of it is on our website and on the Virus and the Host website. There's a link to it. I just can't think of it right now. I was really skeptical until I used it, and I realized that they heat up really fast. So you can literally zip it up, get it started. It's hot in a couple of minutes. You achieve a deep sweat in 10 minutes. They're terribly easy to clean. You really don't have to do much. You zip them back up, close them off, heat them up for another 10 minutes, and it kills most of the bacteria in there. There's no odor associated with them. You can take your hands out and read a book while you're in it. You know, I just sit in there, I wrap a towel around my neck, so I bring a book. Better than going and heating a sauna up, waiting for half an hour, or stoking the fire. And I'm not saying there's not benefits to those things, but those infrared saunas that you can sit in and zip up, they're fantastic, and they're around $1,000. Yeah.
I know that UCSF is doing a study on kind of sauna like that. It's just you're horizontal and you're almost in a Kwanzaa hut, and it just stops at the neck,
Yep.
so your head is out. And they're really finding results with depression, and they're heating, like the body core is kind of going up by a degree, so it's definitely an intense sauna.
Yeah. Yeah, they make the ones you can sit in, you put a chair in, or you can buy the ones you lay down, if you prefer to lay down. Yeah.
And what kind of infrared?
Infrared,
Yeah,
yeah,
what-
yeah.
what kind?
Heaps heater, or deeps heater. Heats deeper, sorry. Heats deeper. Like I said, the brand is on our website. I can't think of the name of the brand right now.
It's like the far infrared, is that what we should
Yes.
ask?
So, Chris, you recommend eating fibrous materials when you're doing the chlorella, the clays, and the charcoal that you mentioned?
Are you
to
asking if
help
you do it at the
carry-
same time?
Well, within the same time frame to help carry that stuff out, or is that something that you concern yourself about when detoxing?
Well, I mean, fiber should make up the greater part of our diet.
But not going out of your way to take extra fiber in.
No, because I believe if you're really eating a healthy diet, you're eating lots of fiber. Because what has the most fiber in it? Fiber is plants. You think about the stalk of a piece of broccoli, that has a lot of fiber in it. A carrot has a lot of fiber in it. A watermelon, much less fiber. So if you're eating that plant-heavy diet, there's plenty of food there for your intestinal bacteria, plenty of fiber to bind up some of those toxins. So that's really my preference. I don't tend to put people on fiber supplements. I just try to get them to eat more vegetables.
Okay. Thanks.
So you don't believe in vaccines for children or
Like that
adults?
they exist, or?
You recommend vaccination for your patients, children, to adults?
Sure, good question. I've been counseling parents on vaccines my entire career. When I got started, I was very interested in pediatrics. I thought that was all I was going to do, was just treat kids. And then I realized that adults have much more interesting diseases, and so I started treating more and more adults. But I still see a lot of kids, and I've always counseled parents on vaccines. And I've always said the same thing. I think for every individual vaccine, you need to make a choice for every single individual child. There should be no one size fits all for any vaccine for any child. Now, because if you live in sub-Saharan Africa and you live 50 miles from a hospital, I might recommend that you get the rotavirus vaccine. If you live in Ashland, 3 blocks from the hospital, and you live in a home where there's clean water and plenty of access to food and medicine. Do I think it's of value to get the rotavirus vaccine? Probably not. So I don't believe there's a blanket statement. Do I think that vaccines in general have made the world healthier? No. I don't. Do I think we've prevented some measure of epidemic disease in certain parts of the world? Sure. But do they literally make us healthier? No. And there's studies to show that. There's studies to show that unvaccinated children are healthier by looking at multiple different markers than vaccinated people.
Go Dr. Paul.
Paul Thomas, yeah. He lost his license for saying so.
Yeah.
So I still think there's a place for them. Do I think 100 years from now we're going to be injecting portions of diseased material into people? I don't. I really don't. But that being said, we work with the tools we have at the time, and so there is probably still a place for vaccination in the world. But I'll tell you, my tendency over the years is to recommend less and less. Now, I also, because I'm a homeopath, and homeopaths have a long tradition of treating infectious disease, I've had the fortunate distinction to be able to treat a lot of the infectious diseases that come through. I've treated mumps, I've treated measles, I've treated all those things. So I have a confidence level with those things that maybe some other people don't, where I feel that I have tools to be able to address those. So I understand if someone doesn't have those tools, that they'd be more inclined to recommend a vaccine.
So in that conversation, Chris, what is being called a vaccine now does not really, in my mind's eye, from what I've read, really match up with what we were talking about with the smallpox and the cowpox and the little bit of, or homeopathic. And so is there anything to be said about that? I mean, it's called a vaccine, but they even noticeably changed the definition as COVID got going. And they were starting to talk about this was the only way to go. 'Cause I just don't think it's a vaccine.
Yeah, they moved the goalpost during the midst of it. They changed the definition. I don't think anyone previous to COVID, if you described the particular platform that they used for the creation of that injection, would have, previous to COVID, called that a vaccine.
Yeah. So that's a very, I mean, just the language alone is off-putting. I mean, in terms of where we are now in this polarity. Are you vaccinated, not vaccinated?
Sure.
What does that actually mean? And speak about the flu vaccine, because that collapse of this vaccine, or this shot and the flu vaccine, did they actually take flu and, and they made a vaccine that was actually utilized from the virus for flu vaccine?
Well, I'd like to say one thing is that, Borla from Pfizer said on record, he said, if we had called this a gene therapy, no one would have taken it. So he stated it.
Yeah.
Now, are you speaking about this particular year's flu vaccine, or are you talking historically about flu vaccines?
I've never taken a flu vaccine, but I just am curious because they start to get collapsed right now. And, this is a flu vaccine or like a flu vaccine, and you've got to have it. But I'm just curious if a flu vaccine was created, with long trials and using the virus of flus to make it.
You mean historically? If they've done that?
Historically.
Well, I mean, you have an understanding of how they do the flu vaccine each year, how that's done?
Not exactly, no.
So, because the influenza virus has an intermediary host of, ducks that fly around the world, they take the few strains that they find of the most common influenza in those birds, and then they try and triangulate in which ones they think will be the most common in that particular flu season. And so that's why you've heard over the years, the flu vaccine can be terribly ineffective. Because if you look at the data of flu vaccines over the last 30 years, their effectiveness ranges between 60% and 10%. And that mainly comes down to the fact that scientists are trying to speculate what circulating, round of influenza will be most predominant in people in that particular season. Now, I think this is a timely question because we're moving into a very big flu season right now. There's a lot of influenza moving around the country. There are some very sick people, and I think this is going to be a very big flu year on the West Coast. Why is that? You know, we tend to have cycles of larger epidemics of influenza. We've all been inside. Many other things have happened. I don't know that I have the answer to why this year is going to be a particularly troublesome one. I am concerned that moving forward, they're going to integrate the influenza vaccine as an mRNA technology and to make it bivalent, or meaning it tied to another virus like SARS-CoV-2. I have concerns around that. I wish that they would just keep it a standard traditional influenza vaccine. And you know, one of the things we should remember about vaccines too is that they're like any other product. So if a product sells well, they make lots of it. If it doesn't sell well, they make less of it. And a good example of this is that, you know, I'll often get parents who would like to just get a tetanus vaccine for their child. They don't want it in the diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus vaccine, which is the most common way it's delivered. They just want tetanus, let's say. Or they just want pertussis, which is whooping cough. And you can't really get it because the vaccine manufacturers don't make it anymore. We don't have access to it. So if people are calling for, or the people that make the decisions say, we want all the flu vaccines at this point moving forward to be mRNA, well, that's what's going to happen. Or if we want to make it bivalent and we want to tie it to something else, that's what's going to happen.
Can you describe a little bit more what you mean by gene therapy versus a classic vaccine and
Sure.
things?
Back to earlier in the talk when we were talking about Lady Mary Montagu and Jenner, these people that took the actual illness itself, be it a bacteria or a virus, right? Because we have immunizations for bacteria and for virus. And one way or another, they weakened those things. They either killed them or they inactivated them. They damaged them in some way to make the organism weaker. And then typically they stick a bunch of toxic stuff to it because your immune system doesn't really react to a weakened or inactivated bacteria or virus. So it needs things stuck to it. And that's where you've heard over the years, oh, there's antifreeze in vaccines or there's aluminum in vaccines. Well, there are compounds that are like that, and they're used because they heighten the immune system's response. The immune system goes, I'm not used to seeing aluminum in the veins. I'm not used to seeing propylene glycol in the veins. And so they have to use toxic compounds to get you to pay attention to those. So that's more of a classic vaccine. You take an organism, you weaken it, you attach some toxic junk to it, and you try and get the immune system to recognize it, and then it mounts a response. It creates antibodies. So in the future, if your immune system sees that thing, it will already have some immunological memory of it. As you can imagine, that whole process in and of itself can create problems. By one, injecting, even if you just took a pure virus or a pure bacteria and you inject it into the bloodstream, that's not how your immune system typically encounters those things. How does it typically encounter them? Your respiratory tract. It's not used to seeing it in your bloodstream. So that by very nature changes the way the immune system responds. Then attach a bunch of toxic compounds to it, and that sets you up for other issues. So I'm not saying that that in and of itself is a horrible thing. I think that people were trying to find light in the dark, and they were trying to find ways to deal with infectious disease. But I think moving forward, we're going to see past that. So that's sort of conventional vaccination. The mRNA technology, which has been around for some time, but has never been used in humans. Never been used in humans. It's been used in animals, not with good success. Essentially what that does is it's a piece of information that then tells the body that receives it to make something. Because, right, we have, you guys remember this from biology, we have DNA and we have RNA. And the RNA matches up with the DNA and like a like two hands holding one another. And that RNA can then code for proteins. It tells the body to make things. So this RNA that's injected into the body goes into the cells and says, make this thing. And in the case of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, it's saying, make the spike protein. Make the S subunit of the spike protein. So you're telling the body to make the toxin itself. That's a little different than conventional vaccination, right? That's a little different than saying, hey, look at this thing over here. I've showed you this thing, now make antibodies to it. Instead, it's saying, you make this thing yourself.
And the purpose of that is what? Then the body's going to do the typical reaction like a regular vaccine? Is that?
It should then make antibodies to that
To
thing
that.
that its own body has made.
Okay.
There may be some problems with that. There may be some problems with telling your instructions, your code to create a toxin internally. There are certainly problems with the idea that that doesn't stay locally in the area that we were told it was going to stay locally. That we know that that information then travels to distal sites in the rest of the body. I don't know why it was chosen.
So myocarditis, pericarditis, cancer, so the VAERS program, the CDC VAERS program, they're kind of squelching this information about all these conditions that are popping up after people have gotten this vaccine. And so I have twofold questions. So can people who have taken the mRNA get it out of their bodies? Or will the body shed it in some way after a number of time? And then I guess my other question is, why are people becoming more susceptible to all of these conditions because of the mRNA? I know it's very loaded.
Yeah. Well, one, we don't know the answer to the first question.
We don't know if it'll get out.
We don't know. And people ask me that every day. And I think there's a lot of people claiming to know the answer to that and offering up solutions to it and selling things and convincing people to take stuff. And I am in no way convinced whatsoever that we have any idea about how to get that out of the body or to turn that thing off. And I hate to say that, and I hope that's not true, and I hope the body in its infinite wisdom knows how to shut that thing down, but I don't see any evidence anywhere that we have proof that you can detoxify the spike protein or remove the mRNA from your body. I haven't seen anything. That particular protein, the S unit of the spike protein, is a sticky little bugger. That's why it was so good in COVID in getting into people and causing all the problems that it did. It has an affinity for a bunch of different receptor sites in the body. The endothelium, the inside of the tubes of your body, there are lots of receptor sites for the spike protein. And so whether you get it naturally through COVID or you get it through an injection, there's a lot of that toxoid in the body. And so that is likely why we're seeing, you have a lot of endothelium in your heart. You have a lot of endothelium in your kidneys. It's all over the place. So that's likely why we're seeing those inflammations in those tissues. You have lots of that toxin there. The immune system has to do something about it.
And that's, the long COVID, sorry, I don't want to, take over, but the long COVID issue, at the beginning of your talk, you talked about becoming healthy. And so long COVID, you could just assume that even though these people looked amazingly healthy and they got long COVID and many died, people who you would say, oh, they wouldn't die, but they did, perhaps they were just inherently unhealthy or living an unhealthy lifestyle, even though they looked.
Only absolutely. Those people had a body burden of toxins. those people had quiet infectious disease. Those people had things going on inside their bodies. Absolutely. The people, I've treated a lot of COVID. I've now treated a lot of long COVID. Every single one of those people that got very sick had something else going on with them. All of them. There isn't the healthy person, and we're now 3 years out from this. I don't believe that there's a healthy person who died from COVID unless, let me just say the unless part, unless they were horribly medically mismanaged. And we saw a lot of that. Yeah. Or fevered at home for 10 days, went to urgent care, got the wrong thing, fevered at home a few more, went back, got the wrong thing again. Like those stories happened, those just poor medical management. But otherwise, those people had a body burden of toxins or infectious disease. And then there's the long COVID. And so now we're seeing lots and lots and lots of long COVID in our office. So that's, for people that don't know, that's the idea that after getting over an acute COVID infection, you still have lingering symptoms or you're still sick beyond a several week period. Now, many of these people, it's now many months beyond COVID. And those are interesting cases for sure. Because it's not really about the virus, I'd say in 99% of them anymore. It's what got triggered and what set off. And so for a lot of people, they're now having a histamine reaction. Histamine, the thing that makes your nose run, makes you cough, makes you sneeze when you have allergies, that S unit of the spike protein is upregulating the production of histamine in the body. So they're having all sorts of histaminic stuff. It's triggering brain fog. A lot of people with brain fog after COVID. It's triggering very severe fatigue. It's kicking up chronic infections in the body. These people that had Epstein-Barr virus or cytomegalovirus or Lyme disease or something else, that virus has then done something to their immune system where those other pathogens are now rising up and causing issues. So it's very much an Achilles heel sort of situation. And, that same question about the headaches, like people go, oh, what do you do for long COVID? Well, I do something different for every single patient. Because every single patient has a different imbalance.
You mentioned that you have also treated a lot of Lyme disease, and have you had success with it?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that much about it, but I remember reading a book of someone who had written on Lyme disease, and he was saying there's only two kinds of people, one who has Lyme's and one who hasn't expressed it yet, So what is is it a virus? Is it it's a bacteria?
It's a spirochete. The closest analog to Lyme is syphilis. They're these funny corkscrew-shaped little bacterium. Yeah.
And people can get it in different ways?
People get it in very different ways. What I always like to say is, you guys remember the story a long time ago when they found that man frozen in the ice? Like 10,000-year-old man who had, a pouch around his neck full of some herbs. The Iceman. And he had some tattoo points along his arm that were along a meridian, a Chinese meridian. He also had Lyme. He had Borrelia in his system. And so Borrelia has been with us for a very long time. A very long time. I think many, many people have Lyme and don't even know it. I wonder if that person who made that statement, I've never heard that before, if they're right.
It was a book on Lyme disease. I can't remember the author. But
It might be true. It might be true. It's really, really common. And because what I see often is that people are sort of going along at a clip, and then something happens, and then they have Lyme. They're going along, and they move into that college dormitory, which was moldy, and then they start to feel bad and they get diagnosed with Lyme. Or they were going along and they have a car accident. And that's not to say at all that people don't go out walking in the hills here and get bit by a tick and then develop Lyme. That happens all the time too. I see that all the time. But I see that other story very frequently. And I've also noted over the years this very interesting interplay between mold illness and Lyme. So much so now that I'm not sure that any of my Lyme disease patients weren't really just sick with mold. It's kind of a hypothesis I'm working through at the moment. And I've gotten a lot of people better from mold or from Lyme by treating their mold. It's honestly the first thing I start with now. It's a huge part of what I do is treat people with mold and Lyme. And we always treat the mold first, and then we sort of see what's left over. And oftentimes you get them through the mold and there's nothing left. They're well. Yeah.
Wow. So Anthony Williams said that everyone has Epstein-Barr. Is that true too?
Mm-hmm. Everyone gets exposed to Epstein-Barr. Epstein-Barr is the virus that's associated with infectious mononucleosis, mono, the kissing disease, you know. And everybody you check who's over a certain age will have antibodies to Epstein-Barr. Some people tend to get in this loop or what are called chronic reactivators of Epstein-Barr. My assertion is those people have a toxic burden. And so the Epstein-Barr just has to keep looping over and over and over again until they express those toxins. Because that's how I get people out of chronic Epstein-Barr. I used to give them red root, and I used to give them istatus, and I used to give them all these things, and they would just still be sick with Epstein-Barr. And I started detoxifying them, and they weren't sick anymore.
Two things. You mentioned low sugar, low or no sugar.
Yep.
What about monk fruit and stevia?
I like monk fruit. I think monk fruit's a good sweetener. I've been starting to read some disturbing things about stevia. I'm starting to steer away from it. There's some science coming out that it might be a form of birth control in a way. It's kind of emerging. I'm just sort of starting to percolate and read more stuff about this. So I'm pumping the brakes on stevia a little bit.
Okay, but monk fruit is okay.
I think monk fruit's okay.
My
So
second
proven
one is,
otherwise.
So you fill up your water bottle with minerals and your tetrahertz wand.
Yeah.
So what minerals? Trace minerals?
Yeah, trace minerals.
And 40 drops, that's what it says on the bottle?
Just
And-
something like that. I
And
give
then
a
the
dash.
tetrahertz wand, where do you
Sure.
get one of those?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of frequency medicine too. I think about a hierarchy or sort of a pyramid of therapeutics in the treatment of people. And that pyramid down at the bottom has things in it like big hammers, you know? The drugs, the surgeries, the very, very heavy hitters, you know, that thank God we have drugs and surgeries. I'm not saying we don't need drugs and surgeries at times. But there's sort of these really heavy hitters. And then as we move up, things get more subtle. In some way, though, they reach deeper, right? You know, a surgery does what a surgery does. It takes an organ out, or it cuts a chunk of something out. But it doesn't really affect the organism in a positive, healing way in any other means. Whereas frequencies like homeopathy or particular frequencies we can generate from a machine, they touch the organism in a very deep way. And they can touch it on a cellular level or many different ways. So tetrahertz frequencies are this range of frequencies that are beyond infrared. And there's starting to be people and companies that make devices that deliver tetrahertz frequencies. And so we have wands that we can use, that we can wand different parts of the body, or we can wand our water. And the idea of wanding the water is that our water is dead. the water that's purified down at the treatment plant here in Ashland, it has no life to it. It's sitting in a pond, it's been filtered, it's had chlorine added to it, but for all intent and purposes, it has very little structure to it. Very healthy structured water, if you imagine a stream or a spring that comes out of the mountains and then rolls over the rocks there, that water gains structure by that movement and by the natural source from which it originates. By using frequencies on our water, we can restructure our water to therefore make it more available to our cells. That's the concept.
So what about ozone water?
We drink ozone water at the clinic. It's like drinking pool water. I don't think that it's structured, but ozonated water, ozonated oils, you can gain some anti-infective properties from that, some anti-cancer properties from that. Yep.
On your website, do you have information about the terahertz frequencies one?
I don't, but we'll put some up there.
You can just Google it.
Yeah, you can look them up. I know there are a lot of companies that make knockoffs of them, so if you want a real one, let me know. Because I see people selling knockoffs of the terahertz ones.
Are you starting, when you make your water in the morning, are you starting with tap water, distilled water, reverse osmosis?
Just filtered tap water.
Filtered tap water.
Filtered tap water, yeah. Yeah. You know, I think some of those would be great choices. It'd be better to use spring water to do it.
Spring water?
Yeah. Yeah.
You have a hyperbaric in your clinic still? Yeah,
Yeah.
say something about that, what you use that for.
Sure, so hyperbaric oxygen is another therapy, and I think this is great we're talking about all these things because I really think about the breadth of all the tools we have to make people be healthier, and I think we should use all of them, and I think we're going to need all of them moving forward. And I don't like to overwhelm people with, well, then you can do this, and then you can do this. But as the questions are coming up, it's good to talk about all these things, right? So hyperbaric oxygen is a therapy that's been around for a long time. Essentially what it is the patient either lies or sits in a chamber of varying sizes, and then that chamber is pressurized, and pure oxygen is pumped into the chamber. So we bought a hyperbaric oxygen chamber 6 or 7 years ago, and I got it mainly for treating autism because I'd read such great things about autistic children. And we've seen some pretty amazing things with autistic children going into the chamber and then coming out and having higher speech function, better cognitive function. Hyperbaric oxygen is also extremely useful in head traumas, people who have had traumatic brain injuries. We use it a lot in the office for people going through radiation therapy for cancer, because if you get hyperbaric oxygen while you're receiving radiation, the tissue damage is minimized, people's energy is better. So hyperbaric oxygen has a lot of long-reaching effects. As you can imagine, you're forcing oxygen into all the tissues of the body. A lot of people use it. We don't tend to do this in our clinic, but a lot of people just sort of do it for wellness. They go, oh, I want to feel better, you know. I'm an athlete, or I want to sort of optimize myself. A lot of people use hyperbaric oxygen for that too. It's classically known in the hospitals for non-healing wounds. So every once in a while, we'll get a diabetic or someone that has a big wound on their leg, and you put them in the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, and within a little bit of time, the wound heals. So it's a super powerful therapy. I love our oxygen chamber. A lot of people are using it for long COVID. A lot of people, you're seeing this. Our tendency in the clinic has been to use intravenous ozone over hyperbaric oxygen. When I started reading the reports of people using hyperbaric oxygen for long COVID, people were talking in the numbers of 30 treatments, 40 treatments, which, okay, if you've got long COVID, you'll do 30 or 40 treatments of hyperbaric oxygen to get better. But what we were finding in the clinic, and we're still doing this, 3 or 4 IV ozones was changing long COVID.
Oh.
So we just went, you know, let's use that instead. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see anything with Asperger's with the hyperbaric?
I can't think of any particular cases. I would imagine so. I can't think of any particular cases though. Yeah. Yep.
You have a beamer device in your office as well. Can you speak to the
Sure.
efficacy of that?
Yeah. there's a theme running through all those therapeutics. And it goes back to my book and the talk in that, the two most common diseases on the planet, as we stated earlier, number one, cardiovascular disease, and number two is cancer. And both of those share the absence of circulation. If you're not circulating well, you go on to develop those diseases. So my whole career, I've hunted for therapies that improve circulation. The Beamer is a mat that one lays on, as well as an applicator device that was developed by a scientist for the Russian space program. And so they were sending the cosmonauts into space with these pulsed electromagnetic frequencies to help keep their circulation going while they were in outer space. You've got lower gravity, you're not pumping your muscles, the blood's not moving around. And they were seeing really good effects with that. So the designer then sort of had an offshoot company that, what I don't love about Beamer is it's a multi-level marketing thing. I don't do multi-level marketings with anything. But the technology itself is quite amazing. So the device you can program with a bunch of different programs ranging from 8 minutes to 20 minutes, or you can cycle through many 20-minute programs over the course of the night. You lay on the mat and it delivers these pulsed electromagnetic frequencies that open up the capillaries. The smallest blood vessels in the body, they get them to open and move the circulation. So it's a really nice adjunctive therapy to other therapies. It's a nice therapy for home use because they're, relatively inexpensive. Like a hyperbaric oxygen chamber costs $20,000. A Beamer costs $5,000. So people do have them in their homes.
The EMF piece of that technology is that, the 5G of the stuff that we're concerned about, because it's not the same stuff, or it's at a lower. What do you understand?
I don't see there's any deleterious electromagnetic frequencies coming off of a Beamer. I've used my meter, and I don't see anything infinitely more dangerous.
Infinitely more dangerous.
You notice I don't have it on my
And
person.
it doesn't help your circulation, don't it?
No, in fact it hinders it. So I like Beamer for that. The downsides of Beamer are you got to use them a lot.
But not very long.
Not very long,
No.
about 8 minutes.
Dr. Pollock, Pawluk, has a website that lists all these different PEMFs.
Yep.
And, he puts Beamer at the top of, just because of multi-level and maybe more expensive than it need be. But he also has others,
Sure.
that he's very much researched. But it's a great tool to look into for people to find what is going on.
Yeah, no, I think they're great. I think that I suspect in the distant future, at some point, all homes will have something like that, where you can go and lay.
Red light therapy? Is it similar to red light therapy?
No.
Okay.
Red light is more analogous to infrared or anything like that, where we're trying to replicate, sunlight, whereas the pulsed electromagnetic frequencies is literally sending a pulse in order to achieve a goal, and different frequencies have different goals. The terahertz frequencies look like they move the lymph. They look like they turn the mitochondria on. They look like they get our cells to dump toxins. The PEMF does similar but somewhat different. And I think over time we'll understand all these different frequencies and their particular applications and uses.
You're talking a lot about circulation. What about asthma, COPD, the respiratory element? Do you have a theory on that, or?
In what context?
Do you think that that's viral stimulated or toxin stimulated? Is it
I see your
related to circulation, since you're circulating air, like you circulate the blood, they're related to each other?
I see your question. Yeah, I understand it. I think about asthma a lot, as I will not uncommonly have a parent bring their child into me for asthma. And if any of you have ever been through this yourself or been through this as a parent, it can be a terrifying, long, drawn-out process of trying to figure out what medications you can use to manage the asthma. And that's really where you end up in the conventional model, is how are we going to manage this thing? It is very uncommon, in my experience, that in the conventional model they look for the reason for the asthma. Every once in a while they'll go, okay, is there an animal in the home, or is there a food? But they're not really trying to figure it out. And I have found in an overwhelming number of cases that the new onset of asthma in a child is due to mold. So that's the first place I look. If I hear that a kid has asthma and I don't have any other reason to know what it is, I look for mold, and I find it all the time. Remembering that you don't necessarily have to be living in mold right now for you to still have asthmatic symptoms or other symptoms from mold. It's more common, but you could have lived in a moldy home and gotten sensitized to that thing, and now periodically you go to the school or you go to the church or you go to grandma's, and there's a little bit of mold there or a higher moldy index environment, and you're having respiratory symptoms from it. Or the foods that you're eating then, or the animal that you're then exposed to, start to trigger that. So that's typically where I think about asthma. I mean, there's a couple other roads with asthma. Asthma can have a deep emotional component too, I've seen. That an emotional event or something that's happening can trigger that. COPD is interesting. That goes much more down the toxicological road. Those types of diseases where you have a buildup of something in the tissue of the lungs, a chronic inflammatory state, it's often associated with toxins. So there can be an infectious piece too. You know, there are some common infections that are chronic infections that don't get looked for, that can cause chronic inflammation in the lungs, can cause sclerosis in the lungs. You know, some of the types of chlamydia can do that. And those things never get looked for. They never get looked for. These common arthropathies too, like ankylosing spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis, and these things that people just go, oh, I have rheumatoid arthritis. My grandma had rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, you would be shocked at how often I hear that. People have been told that, and they just come to believe it, that the fact that someone else in their family had something means, oh, well, I have it too. Well, you have it too because you got that same bacteria from grandma, or your immune systems both don't really know how to react to that bacteria, and it's a bacteria we're all exposed to, but when you're exposed to it, you develop these symptoms. And if we just looked for that bacteria and we cleared it from your system, you would no longer present with rheumatoid arthritis.
I never heard somebody talk about arthritis and bacteria before.
Nobody ever talks about it. It's not like it's not in the scientific literature. It's there. You can go on PubMed and you can read about it. It's there. It drives me bananas. This applies to a lot of common health conditions, a lot of them, that people just don't even recognize that there are known triggers. I don't believe there's anything idiopathic.
What's that mean?
It's a term that's used in conventional medicine to me that says we don't know why. It just happens.
Yeah, it's a miracle.
Idiopathic hypertension. You've heard that one before. Idiopathic asthma. Like people apply, I don't actually believe there's anything idiopathic.
How do you address the mental emotional component?
With patients. Sure. The question was, how do you address the mental emotional aspects of illness with patients? It's arguably the most important thing. You know, there are schools of medicine that I've studied, some in depth, some just tangentially, where they make the claim that all disease originates from that place. And that very well may be true. I can't say whether it is or not. But I feel that if you don't address the mental emotional state with patients, they will not get well. And so there's a wide range of ways to do that. Not to sound like a broken record, but because I'm a homeopath, I often reach for homeopathy. And homeopathy can touch that place of a mental emotional state. You can see people in acute psychoses who you give a remedy to where they come out of it. You can see people who are in the deepest, darkest, bleakest depressions with the shotgun to the mouth, and you give them a remedy and it changes it. You can see people who have overwhelming panic attacks and agoraphobia who cannot leave their home, and you give them a single pellet of an infinitesimal dose of a substance of which there is nothing left in there but the energetic imprint. And they don't have a panic attack again. So that's my inclination to reach for that one. As you come off of that in other directions, I think the flower essences, which are in a similar way, Edward Bach, who was a scientist who came up with the Bach flower remedies, and those touch people in that same sort of way. They're really, really useful tools. The right herb given on those indications, you know, each herb has a mental emotional state associated with it too. Sometimes giving a single plant can really help people in that way. I'm a huge fan of not necessarily hours and hours of couch time of talk therapy. I think in some ways, if we're talking about a paradigm, that in some ways that is a lower on the pyramid. It's still extremely useful. It's good for people to talk about things. People need that, but it doesn't touch people in the same way that some of those other therapeutics do. But I like therapies that have a body-centered approach to them, where we're moving energy, but we're also talking about the process. People that do Reiki or spiritual healing, channeling, things of that nature that can also crack through that stuff. That stuff is so incredibly important. I'm not a huge fan of the suppressive antidepressants and anti-anxiolytics. They have a place sometimes. There's no doubt that sometimes people are just in a crisis and you have to give a drug, but they don't tend to touch that place that helps people heal.
What do you think of Richard Shoemaker's work on mold, and that maybe just less than 1/3 of the population has the genetics to just not be able to clear the molds and the mycotoxins?
Yeah, so all of my trainings and teachings in mold all come down out of Richie Shoemaker's work. So, you know, second generation of his stuff. He's a medical doctor who sort of has done the most work in trying to understand mold illness and mycotoxin illness. And though the whole HBLA genetic piece, he's pretty much disregarded, as well as most of his students have sort of said, like, that no longer holds true. But there is something about a certain percentage of the population doesn't do a good job of getting rid of it. It's just that those are no longer really recognized to be sort of the Rosetta Stone of this person has it and this person doesn't. And I can speak to that because I used to run those genes on all my patients too, and it did not match up with people's clinical symptoms.
So what is the current thinking?
We don't know. There's like 1/3 of the population that's are lousy detoxifiers of mold. And maybe their immunological system doesn't recognize mold very well too, that they go live in a moldy place and they get colonized with the mold and their immune system doesn't know how to deal with it. Versus somebody else who works in a moldy environment every day and their immune system goes, oh, spore, you know, and just knocks it out. And I certainly see that to be true. I have married couples, one who is sicker than hell from mold and the other one's a mold inspector. Like it literally, it doesn't, it's...
And you still find, like I'd heard that, oh yeah, 15% of the body should really have the bad bugs so that the body can kind of distinguish it from, you know, that it's, as long as it's in the body but at a low level, it's actually helpful because it's, you know, it knows it's there and it's aware of it and it's not getting out of control, or no, that 15% should be cleared out of the body as well.
No, I don't think we fully understand it, but I very much believe that we are a huge bag, for lack of a better word, of bacteria and viruses and fungus and molds. And back to my earliest point, that if we are healthy and taking care of ourselves, you have pathogens inside of you that when you're unhealthy will kill you. They'll kill you. But if you're healthy, they don't do anything. Then there's the other critters that we pick up along the way, like certain protozoas, maybe Lyme, maybe other stuff that you're not born with, they're not naturally in you, but you're going to come in contact with you. And I do think that this immunological challenge idea is important. You know, if your immune system never has anything to do, well, what happens to immune systems that never have anything to do? They tend to develop more autoimmune diseases. We know that. So yeah, there is an interplay that has to happen with the exterior and the interior in order to keep people healthy.
Yeah, I've heard that. When you're really sick or whatever, the bad bugs are actually just the ultimate recycler. They're there to take the body out and transport it to the next state.
They might be.
Do you have any recommendation for like a scar cream after surgery?
So I typically use vitamin E, and then there's a homeopathic called thiocyanamine, which I found to be really useful. Yep, topical thiocyanamine. Sometimes we'll do interscar injections of some homeopathics that work really well too, but I usually start with those. And you know, deep massage, going cross fiber to the scar. You want to really break it up and get those things in there. Yeah.
How about right after surgery?
No, not right after.
These that you recommended for right after surgery?
Vitamin E. Yeah, we'll use vitamin E.
And the second one you recommend?
Thiocyanamine we typically do later on,
Later
and
on.
that'll help break down scar tissue.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you. When you were saying kind of deep massage, I've been very intrigued with fascia, you know, and that kind of unsung part of our bodies that seem to wrap around cells and the whole body, and your kind of movement thing is to move that as well. And I just wondered if you address that with patients about, you know, getting the fascia to move, because it's also part of our hydration.
Sure.
Big
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, it's part of the way. So fascia is that connective tissue that envelops every single part of our body and is contiguous from the tip of your toe all the way to the top of your head. And when you're born and you're a baby, your fascia is in these perfect sheaths around all your muscles and all of your organs. And then as we go through life and things happen to us, we develop tension or tears or scar tissue. You know, and the way I think about that is like if you put a nice clean sheet on the bed and you laid it all out, and that's the baby's fascia. And then as life goes on, you take a corner of it and you twist it and turn it, right? And you twist it and turn it around here. Yeah, and that's what happens to our fascia. And so a lot of musculoskeletal complaints, a lot of organ complaints, a lot of diseases can be traced to dysfunction in the fascia. I mean, there's also a lot of really interesting research that these microtubules inside the fascia are probably how a lot of things travel throughout our body. They don't have to go through these big gross pathways of the circulation or the lymph, but that literally through the microtubules that molecules are moving in these ever-changing geometric tubes. It's super cool stuff. So I'm a big fan of deep musculoskeletal work, a fan of rolfing. I think everybody in their health program needs to have body work done. And we kind of ignore it. We kind of think, oh, it's a luxury. Like, oh, I'll get a massage this year. I just had some very deep work done by a practitioner yesterday. It was amazing, the things he found. And, you know, my foot's moving straight today. He was working on meridians and in the fascia and in capsules that I didn't even know were tight. And my hips are looser today. So I believe that in a true health program that is those 4 tenets of the plow, but are also the use of plants and herbs and frequency medicine and homeopathy, that we also need to be getting body work. I mean, it's the biggest system in your body, literally.
You know, I've been reading and listening audio on Unblock Your Body with a woman's work who really got in and started working first by her hands, you know, her belly and this and that, you know, because just she got that that's what was going on, and then found a block that she could lay on and do this, and just it's quite remarkable, this idea of getting the fascia kind of unlocked.
Did she have an incident or something that set it
Yeah,
off?
well,
an
I think, you know,
accident or
her path was to become a therapist for sports, but she started gaining weight as a young woman. You know, everything that she tried to do just made her balloon out. And she just couldn't quite figure out. Her study was physical therapy and all of this. But what she determined was that, you know, just this whole, and it could be tied in with trauma as well. I think she says that. But just the idea of this sort of secret part of ourselves, like you say, the connective tissue around everything that, you know, I don't, and she talks about, you know, kind of micro movements, you know, just things that we can do to just think fascia, you know, that we don't mostly think in our skin bags, that we have this stuff that we need to keep moving, and lymph, kind of the same, you know, it doesn't have a pump, and so it's like, how do we get that stuff?
No, I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah, good.
Pernicious anemia, how does it develop and why is it more common as people get older?
Yeah, so pernicious anemia is the idea that we would have diminished B12 available to our red blood cells. And so the common idea is that people's gastrointestinal function diminishes as they age. And I would say that I could see that from having plenty of patients in their 5th, 6th, 7th decades of life, that the ability to absorb nutrition from the gastrointestinal tract diminishes. So there are pathogens that steal B12 also. Detoxification requires a lot of B12. So those can play into it also. It can not only just be that I'm not making as much stomach acid as I used to, but I have critters that are taking it, or I'm going through a lot of detoxification. And I talk about that in the book, that's one of the reasons I think that people should do detox every single day, is because you want to be prepared before some big immunological thing happens. Right? You don't want to have to play catch up when the next big virus comes. And it's good to get your house in order before those things happen and establish, why do I have pernicious anemia? You know, there's a reason. It's not idiopathic. Like maybe I am trying to get rid of heavy metals in my body, which eats up a lot of B12.
Why do we have decreased gastric function? Do the people in Okinawa or the green zones have, or blue zones, do they have decreasing gastric function? Or why do people in America have a decreased gastric function?
I mean, I have a lot of theories on that. I can't speak to whether or not they do. I would suspect that a lot of ours has to do with the way we live. Our stress, what we eat, how we eat, the toxins. You know, there are plenty of people in their 90s who are extremely healthy. But there's less and less and less of them all the time.
What's a vegetarian way to get B12?
Yeah, so B12 primarily comes from meat sources. That's the best way you can get B12. Yeah, meat sources. Same thing with iron. You know, people always say, oh, well, you just eat lots of spinach. You have to eat a room full of spinach, literally, to get as much iron as you do in a steak. And I fully get that there are people that are vegetarians. They will, you know, they know it in their soul. And so typically in those people, I advocate for supplementation or injections. We do a fair amount of B12 shots. It's a safe procedure. There's no side effects. You know, it's like, it's a gentle, easy thing to do to get your B12 levels up. Yeah.
I've read that 100 years ago, when people just went out into their garden and picked something and ate it without washing it, because it had microorganisms on it that made B12, they could actually get B12 from vegetables.
I've heard that also.
Because it was really from the microorganisms.
I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that also. Yeah. Yeah.
I keep hearing that the third cause of disease in the country is iatrogenic.
Doctor cause.
Doctor cause.
Yeah.
Misdiagnosis, use of drugs, mistakes made in hospitals.
Yeah.
Is that, do you see that is correct?
Absolutely.
And what, don't we have a vaccine for that? I got one, it's called lead. It's really, and no, third cause of death, and nobody is dying. And here the hospital's doing what they've been doing recently, and this, well,
They
that-
even get paid for the
I
deaths.
suppose the cure for that, or the prevention of that is, don't go to the hospital.
Right.
If you-
Places to avoid.
Don't get sick, well, so that's because there's no other, apparently no discussion that I've seen about that.
Well, what we have seen is that children have gotten healthier through the pandemic. They have done a couple studies now that showed that children had a lower incidence of death and disease overall through the pandemic.
Less doctor visits.
And why?
Less doctor visits.
Because of not going to school?
Right, or, well,
That's possible too. People are making the leap, and I made the leap, that it means they went to the doctor less. There's less incidence of SIDS through the pandemic. I don't think that has to do anything with school. You know, sudden infant death syndrome. SIDS went down during the pandemic.
Yep.
So, I mean, there's no doubt that people are killed in the allopathic model. Absolutely.
And the
And-
study that Paul did, Dr. Paul,
Sure.
that was a mind blower. What?
And here's the thing, like, there's a doctor right now, she's a girl I went to school with. Her name's Julie Mazzy, she's a naturopath. You read about this week. She just got sentenced to 33 months in jail. Now, I'm not advocating for what Julie did. I'm not saying what Julie did was right. But people on the outskirts, on the outside, who are not part of the system, pay for their mistakes in a much greater way than people do inside of the system. Okay? Since we've been having this discussion, 10 people have died in the United States because of allopathic medication. Since we started talking about this. If one naturopath does one thing and hurts one person or breaks the law, they go to jail. So it's imbalanced, unfortunately. To the other point, I've watched over the course of my career how the FDA and other agencies have systematically come along and tried to take away some of our best therapeutics.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
We watched an amazing medication called artesunate. This was an injectable made from artemisia or wormwood. This very safe injectable compound made by compounding pharmacies was taken away from us a couple of years ago. We were using artesunate to treat cancer, chronic Epstein-Barr virus, a whole bunch of different things. It was sort of a miracle. The FDA took it away from us, and then not a month later, a drug company filed a patent for a similar compound to be used as a chemotherapeutic. So the playing field is not level at all.
Like a church and make that stuff the sacrament then?
That's a good question.
That's how the senior pass lost that
Just thinking out loud.
to the Al pass.
Wormwood.
Yeah. And we're going through it right now. There's a bill coming up before Congress around homeopathy. And so we need to stand up and preserve our right to homeopathic medications. They're extremely safe. They're extremely effective. I've never seen anyone die or get hurt from a homeopathic medication. Never once. Never
I actually met
once.
a lady, her children are alive today because of homeopathy. The medical community, they got some giardia, from water or something. And the medical community finally just gave up on it. There's nothing we can do to help your kids. And then she, out of desperation, took them to homeopathy, and they're alive today and well.
And there's millions
Yeah.
of stories like that.
Yeah.
And it's been maligned, and it's
Yeah.
been said that it's quackery and that it's not effective, and none of those things are true. Homeopathy is also probably the planet's most sustainable medication. We literally already have every remedy we need. We don't need to take down a single plant or kill a single animal. We already have the base materials for every remedy we would ever need moving forward for the history of the planet, unless we discover a new substance. But for all of the common medications, we don't have to take anything else from nature from it.
And Chris, this week there was a hearing about this, and they didn't show up. I mean, so I was one who sent in my thing
Sure.
to this and that. What is it that we can do around this issue? I mean, I get that we've been on hold for 5 years because this came up 5 years ago and somehow it got tabled.
Yeah.
And now it's back, with the FDA and the
Yep.
and looking quite serious in that they didn't show up.
So we have a link on our website that says
Okay.
Support Natural Medicine. It's on our Ashland Natural Medicine website, which is our clinic website. And there's links on there to supporting the different organizations that are standing up for not only homeopathy, but for compounded medications too. Those are on the chopping block. So people that take compounded bioidentical hormones, people that take compounded thyroid, the FDA and those organizations are trying to get rid of those also. So visit that link on our website frequently. We add new things to there, not infrequently. There's petitions to sign. The Americans for Homeopathy Choice is a big organization.
The Alliance for Natural Health too.
Alliance for Natural Health. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. And I think really what we have to do is we have to spread the word. So you just have to talk about this with people, because most people have no idea. One, people don't even know what homeopathy is. They misuse the term. They think anything natural means homeopathy, and that's not what homeopathy is. And I think most people are shocked when they hear about, I use artesunate as an example. They go, what? The FDA took that away and then they're going to turn it into a drug? So you just you got to be the squeaky wheel.
Just about a month ago, I was notified by my compounding pharmacy in California that they can no longer compound methylcobalamin, which is a vitamin B12, and they can't compound glutathione. And it turns out none of the compounding pharmacies in California can make methylcobalamin or glutathione. And I wrote to the California legislature, to the Assembly and the Senate, and I wrote to the governor, and I said, hey, I have pernicious anemia, where am I going to get methylcobalamin? It's been a real journey finding a pharmacy that can compound it. And I just found one, I think, today.
Yeah.
But it's taken me weeks.
Yep.
And in addition, the desiccated thyroid hormone that I was on a couple years ago, WP thyroid, that was made by RLC Labs. And rumor has it that RLC Labs was bought by Armor, and that actually the FDA wants to go after desiccated thyroid hormone in general. And also I was getting compounded women's reproductive hormones from a place in Women's International Pharmacy in Wisconsin, in Madison. And they were bought out by Belmar Pharma in June of 2021. So really, pharma's buying up and shutting down, or getting the FDA, who some people say FDA is actually an arm of pharma, that people go from working within pharma to working for the FDA
We know
and
this
back
to be
to
true.
pharma.
Yeah. We've seen this over and over again in our clinic. We have an IV suite, we do intravenous medicine. It is by far the most challenging thing to constantly procure medicines, because it's always changing. The pharmacies are under very, very strict regulation, which they should be to a degree, but it seems to be more difficult for them than other ones. They're constantly having a hard time getting source compounds, and they're having the FDA come down on them and say they can't make stuff. So there's a full frontal attack on natural medicine happening right now. And so all of us need to be as vocal as possible. Join the groups, sign the petitions, go to the rallies, send the money. We have to do it, or our medications are going to be gone. I think we're out of time, everybody. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight.